Right, so I've come over to the right side of the turret where the loader is, and the seat, as you can see, is a bit far forward, and my guess is this is purely for travel. Although, if you look at pictures, you find, I believe that frequently the rear hatch is open and the loader is just sitting up on that. The seat does fold up out of the way. I shall now demonstrate. There's actually a little cotter pin in here, which I didn't bother putting in earlier. And then it folds down. So now the loader has a full range of access around his relatively cramped side. All right, so now that I have the seat out of the way, I have a little bit more room to maneuver. I can only imagine that they removed it in combat. To my front, you can see the elevation gearing and also the control rod for the traverse. There was sometimes an auxiliary manual traverse on the loader side, so the loader could help the gunner out. A relatively nice feature. Up above it, we have the MG34 coaxial machine gun. Underneath that is a funnel to catch the spent brass. That then comes down this metal chute into what would be a collector down here. Now, we've removed the collector because this also allows us to lift up the platform. Simply enough, underneath the platform you'll be able to see storage for 3 rounds of ammunition, and you can also see the double torsion bars. Now you can see why the torsion bars were somewhat controversial for German design at the time. Yes, we now know that they are a very good form of suspension, but back then they were concerned about the loss of space. The torsion bars take up several inches that could otherwise be used for stowage or simply lowering the turret basket. While we're down here, we can also have a look at the hull stowage. All the 79 rounds of main gun ammunition were stowed in the hull. At least I certainly don't see any racks in the turret, and neither do I see much room for rounds. There were either stored 40 of them horizontally in the sponsons, or the rest were stowed vertically. The base of the round was actually pretty much on the sub-turret floor itself. They sit a lot lower than the racks appear to indicate. So they did leave a little bit of stowage room for MG34 boxes. There are about 34 of them on the tank. We can also see the travel lock. Behind and underneath the gun is the casing collector. It's a simple sort of trap door system, spring loaded. Shell casing falls down and in theory should fall into this collector, although I suspect there's probably a little bit of nudging required to help it down. It does 2 things. Firstly, obviously it stops the shell casings from rattling around inside the turret floor, maybe jamming something or causing the loader to trip up. Secondly, because it has the lid top, it also reduces the fumes which are inside the tank. So combined with the bore evacuator, obviously the Germans were thinking a little bit ahead of the game here. So in the interest of science, I'm going to sacrifice my body with all sorts of dings and bangs and cuts and bruises, etc. that you get from the tank. I'm going to demonstrate loading a round. Okay, so as I say, firstly, the round is in the hull. Now, at least they're all over the place, so no matter which way the turret is facing, the loader can usually grab a hold of a round of something. So in this case, I'm going to take one out of a hull sponson. And as you can see, firstly, this is not a small round. It's also not a light round. You then bring it up. Get your hand around. Maybe it's easier to go above, I'm not sure. And shove the round into the breech. Now, imagine trying to do this rapidly and repeatedly. So, oh great, it's stuck. The gunner, of course, is busy traversing, so you got to make sure that the gunner knows not to traverse until you actually have the round in your hand. So the other way I can think of doing this is get it up over. Maybe not. So it does look like the best way of doing this is actually to bring it under the recoil guard, over, bring your hand around, and then shove it in. And of course, you're doing all this, well, granted, again, back then they were a bit shorter, but I suspect people are still bashing their heads a lot. there really isn't a hell of a lot of room to manhandle a big long round like this in here. So whatever the claimed rate of fire is, I suspect it's only for either prepared ammunition or ammunition which is being put into a sweet spot for loading. Still, I guess if your first round actually kills the target, who needs to reload quickly? I suspect, however, especially when dealing with infantry on multiple targets, that rapid fire is a bit of a necessity. And frankly, this turret could do with being a bit bigger. So as I mentioned outside, the pistol ports were deleted and replaced by this grenade launcher. Now, of course, there's no way of aiming it, although it will adjust in azimuth. But probably the simplest thing to do is to simply have it facing forward, and the loader simply sets them off this way. The gunner will actually do the aiming. You'll find we actually do something similar on the M1A ones. We'll set the 50 caliber facing it to 12 o'clock, and for the commander's engagement, he'll actually use the whole turret to aim, as opposed to trying to use the alternate aiming systems. The one place of visibility that he has, the periscope, it's fixed in elevation and traverse. He's looking slightly off to the right, and that is his world. I have to say, I'm not entirely sure I'd want to be a Panther loader. Still, I'll probably beat some other jobs. That's it for the loader's position. Let's go into the hull. Maybe things are a bit better down there. So I moved down into the hull, into the radio operator's position, and my first thought upon getting in was, you must be joking. The seat is comfortable. I'll grant you, it kind of rocks backwards and forwards to give me a little bit of relaxation, and the seat back will fold up and down to make it easier to get in and out. My legs, however, seem to have somehow missed the thought process of the designers. I have a spot about a foot wide, slightly off to my right, between the brake and the final drive, and underneath the power shaft, which, at least unlike some other vehicles, does have some protective shielding around it so that my legs are not going to get caught in the rotating shaft. To his left, the radio, simple enough, and in fairness to the Germans, at least I have no problem getting into all the dials and knobs. An FUG-5, company or platoon commanders would also have an FUG-2. To his front, he has his MG34. It's a KZF optic, and I guess I better demonstrate the use of the headrest. I call it a headrest. That's actually a rest for the machine gun to rest on your head, not for your head to rest on anything else. It is partially balanced by use of a spring to the front, but a lot of the weight is taken up by your head. So you put the headrest into position, put your head to the side, and you are now able to see around. The field of vision for this sight is absolutely atrocious, and I do mean bad. He has one periscope to his right, and at angles maybe about 45 degrees, so really he's got very little way of seeing which way he's going. What I can do, however, is demonstrate the loading process. So let's say he happened to have a bag of MG34 ammo lying around such as this. He'll have to undo the strap, lift open the lid, put the ammunition off to one side, and then he would lean forward and attach it to the system. Right, so with the ammunition now ready to be loaded, it hooks on to a rail here, lift up the latch, it is secure, thread the ammo up onto the feed tray, get the headrest out of the way, put the ammo in position, lock down the feed tray. Of course, in a real gun, this would be easier. Charge it, and you're clear to continue. One last point to note while I'm down here is, of course, the transmission is up front and there is no access board. There's no way at all of accessing the transmission. And part of me wonders if maybe the reason that the transmission and final drives caused so much trouble was because it was so hard to maintain them in any way, shape or form. Imagine you have to pull this thing out. There are photographs of it. You have to remove everything that is, you got to get rid of the machine gun, you got to get rid of the radio systems, you got to disconnect the main power shafts, and then you have to remove the entire armor plate, the whole roof, which contains the hatches for the driver and the radio operator. Then you can pull out the entire transmission system through the whole roof to replace it. Then somehow you got to slide the replacement one back in. It doesn't bear thinking about. The words, "Oh my God, our transmission needs to be replaced," is probably words of horror for the German tank crews and even worse, the German mechanics back in the day. I can only assume that when a Panther did break down, just repairing the final drive took so much longer than, say, on a Sherman or T-34. You can imagine how long a vehicle would have been out of the fight, awaiting repair for even a simple final drive changeout. Anyway, I'm going to hop over now to the other side and see if the driver's position is any better. Somehow I'm not hopeful. Driver's position is substantially better. I'm not entirely sure how to manage it. I suspect what they've done is they've actually shifted the transmission a little bit off to one side. I can quite easily place both of my legs under the power shaft at the same time. Of course, the reason you might want to do that is that you have two pedals. One is the accelerator and one is the clutch. To see out, his primary optic is a simple periscope to his front. He has another one off to the front left. In times of low threat, he can open up the port in the front plate, and that is done by releasing a couple of levers and letting it spring forward. You can then lock it into place. Now, when they deleted the port in the hull, then even in no threat environments, the only way the driver could see was by using his small little periscope, which frankly, it ain't the greatest. So as a result, they actually started installing a second seat up and behind them based off of this main ammunition stowage. And they also added control extensions so that the driver could drive with his head out, sitting on the second seat, while still manipulating all the controls. It's probably an easy way of doing it, but that's what they went with. The transmission itself is a 7-speed manual. It's synchronized except in first and reverse. To get into those, you have to lift up a little gate, and then you can get the vehicle into gear. It's a little bit tight against the transmission casing. I've bashed my elbow a couple of times doing this so far, but I'm sure after a while you'd get used to it. Steering is a little bit complicated. There are 2 levers, and there are 3 positions for each lever, depending on how much you need to steer. So if you pull back just a little bit before the first notch, what you're going to do is you're going to disengage the steering brake, and this effectively loses power to the inside track. It doesn't apply a brake. All it does is the outer track has power, the inner one doesn't, so your turn radius is going to be dependent pretty much on the consistency of the ground. If you bring it all the way up to a notch position, what you've now done is you've engaged radius steering. And this is a fixed gear ratio. Power does go to both sprockets at all times, however, at different ratios. So depending on what gear you're in, your steering will be different accordingly. In first gear, your steering radius is 5 meters. In 7th gear, it's 80 meters. And this was the preferred form of steering, and drivers were expected to learn ahead of time which gear they needed to be in order to steer. Finally, for the hardest of turns, if you go all the way up to the top, past the notch, you start engaging the brake to that track. It is obvious to note that there is no brake pedal, and I can't see any way easily of stopping the vehicle. The only thing I can think of is you put the transmission into neutral first and then pull back on both of the steering levers to activate the brakes. I'm not convinced that's true though, because the manual is specific that you should never pull back on both levers at the same time. It's sort of a strange neutral steer idea. It's not a geared neutral steer as we'd ordinarily expect. The manual states that depending on the consistency of the ground will determine whether or not you actually neutral steer in one spot or you pivot around a track. One last thing to note about steering is in reverse, steering is reverse as well. So pulling back on the left stick, for example, will cause the tank to turn to the right, just to keep you on your toes. Outside of that, the vehicle is, I guess, reasonably simply laid out. I do like the Maybach logo on the tachometer. You will note it goes to 100 kilometers an hour. I do not think that the tank could get to 100 kilometers an hour. In fact, if it ever got over here, somebody's doing something very strange. Simple controls, the circuit breakers to his right, the starters are here. Of note, when starting cold, this is a three-man job. You have to have the radio operator and a loader are cranking an inertial starter. You do not use the electrical starter on a cold motor. He has obviously spare ammunition behind him. He has spare ammunition in the sponson to his left. All in all, this is last position, of course. As been going around the tank, I have a couple of thoughts. Firstly is, it was a hell of a restoration. I'm looking at all the components that go in, even just in the driver's compartment, that had to be pulled apart and rebuilt precisely. It is absolutely amazing. The second thought is I am very impressed by the tank itself as a tank. It has so much potential and it's just such a capable tank. The last thought is I really am not impressed by this tank. It seems to have so many flaws in its design. And everybody talks about it being overcomplicated. I don't think that's the issue. I think it just... they forgot some of the fundamentals, I think, of what you have to get right in a tank. And it just strikes me as being too cramped, too designed for a certain form of battle. Long-range fighting, for example, look at the gunner's optics. Yeah, maybe at long range on the Russian steppes, that narrow field of vision will work for him. But overall, I'm not entirely sure I want to go to war in this tank. And I realize this is something of a controversial comment given the reputation the Panther has. And, you know, I've said this before, yes, T-34 drivers and Sherman crewmen are going, oh my God, it's a Panther. And they're faced with this thing which has a huge cannon and a lot of armor. But I don't think they truly understood the discomfort that was going on inside the vehicle. And I suspect that was a large reason why the inferior Allied tanks were able to knock these things out in ratios to their favor, simply because it was so hard for a crew to get the most out of this vehicle. I think I'm going to leave it at that and get out. Even when it made it to the fight though, just because you really had to respect this vehicle did not mean it was invulnerable. Although certainly some tanks found it easier to knock out than others. Still, the Panther legend alone makes this tank a vehicle worth seeing. We'll see you on the next one. It can't be right. Third time's a charm. That's why you wear helmets in a tank if you can, and you don't wear a beret. And I don't care what the British say.